Once again, we find ourselves around the fire, sitting with good friends and good company, for more great tales. Welcome to Cozy Horror, with me, Dr. Plague. Let's get you settled in with something warm to drink, a nice, soft place to sit, and some cool stories to get you through your day. Today's theme is strange shadows, and boy, have I got some strange shadows for you. Starting us off, we'll read a story about a man whose actions have consequences. Consequences he doesn't discover until it's nearly too late. So, let's hear a story about meeting the Dark Watchers. I've been sitting on this for a little while, but I think it's time. This happened about 3 years ago. I was, without a doubt, the worst kind of hiker. You know those guys who are all leave no sign, bagging their garbage, burying their poop, cleaning up their campsite, respecting nature's natural beauty and all that? Yeah, that wasn't me. I liked camping. My parents liked camping. But there was always a mentality of the woods will take care of things. I watched my dad leave a whole cooler full of empty beer cans at the site one time when I was 8. We brought a couch with us on a camping trip one time, just because Dad knew of a ravine nearby. Broken fishing rods, left those by the creek. Garbage, right on the ground. Hell, we left a whole tent once because Dad couldn't get it back in the bag. We didn't use campgrounds either. Mom and Dad would pack up and find somewhere in the middle of nowhere and just live off the land for a couple of days, then leave their crap behind. I can't say that this is why I am the way I am. I know better than to litter and be a pig, but in my head, the woods will always take care of themselves. It's been here for millions of years. Why is my trash and stuff gonna mess with it? If my styrofoam cooler kills a couple of trees, then they didn't deserve to be there, right? That's what I thought, at least. I go camping about 3 times a year. The start of spring, the start of summer, and the end of summer. I live in California, so I always just pack up my pickup, get some food and beer and recreational greenery, and head out to somewhere remote. A buddy of mine from work hadn't shut up about this overlook an hour from the city, right outside the Santa Lucia mountain range, and I figured I'd go crash out there for a weekend. Unlike my parents, I'm not a living off the land kind of person. I brought food, I brought stuff, and I intended to do nothing but sit in the wilderness, sleep in my hammock, and get buzzed. I called out Friday and found the perfect spot by lunchtime. It was gorgeous, overlooking the valley and so remote that if I were to get really hurt, I'd probably die out here with no one the wiser. I set up my hammock, set out my fire logs with some water, just in case, and just kinda spread out a bit. I made some lunch, sandwiches, rolled a joint, and just kinda got mellow for a bit as the day rolled on. It was nice out here, just watching the clouds and listening to nature. I was soon pretty well lit, and the sun started creeping down as I set to lighting my fire. There was probably a burn ban in effect, but I had water, and I didn't care. Out here, no one was going to see me anyway, and I started roasting hot dogs as the sun cut a fantastic line across the sky. That was the first time I noticed them. I remember looking up and whispering, "Shit," as I mistook them for rangers or cops or something. They were just silhouettes on the ridge, not far from my camp, 3 or 4 of them, and they had these wide, flat-topped hats, like park rangers or the guy on the oatmeal box. I watched them for a minute, thinking I was busted, but they just stood there. They didn't move, they didn't call out, but I know they saw me. My fire had to be visible for a ways at this height, and the longer they stayed there, the more creeped out I felt. Why were they just standing there? If they wanted me to leave, then why not tell me to leave? I didn't know, but once the sun set, I noticed they had vanished and just kept an eye peeled. I had my gun, a big old .45, so I wasn't worried, but I suddenly wished I had a tent to sleep in instead of just a hammock. I sparked up again after eating a pack of dogs, though, and that took some of the edge off. Took any thought of the shadow guys out of my mind whatsoever. I dozed off in my hammock, but I dreamed about them that night, too. I dreamed that they were in my campsite, just standing around and watching me. They were like the outlines of people, like when someone stands in front of the sun and all you get is a burnt-out image of them. They didn't have any features, no eyes or anything, and I was frozen there as they looked at me. They didn't say anything. They just watched me, and it felt like being sleep paralyzed the whole time. I woke up after dawn, almost fell out of my hammock, and started making breakfast as I stirred up the ashes of last night's fire. I wondered if it had really been a dream or not, but I felt like it must have been. Why would they come out here not to say anything? All my stuff was there, too, down to the hot dog wrappers I'd left on the ground next to the fire. I tossed it in absent-mindedly and ate eggs and ham. The ice was still holding out. It was spring and not too hot yet, so I decided to go for a forest pub crawl today. Translation, I put a bunch of beer into my backpack and walked out into the woods so I could have a drunk hike. I spent about 5 hours hiking in the woods, tossing my dead soldiers into the trees as I finished them. Some of them broke, most of them didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I hiked in the woods. I never saw anything. It wasn't like I spotted someone hiding behind a tree, but it was like deep pockets of shadows that shouldn't have been there. It was midday. The sun was high, and I should have had major visibility. Even so, I found myself looking around as the crawling feeling just got worse and worse. Some of it was being drunk in the hot woods with no water, and when I found a stream, I plunged my face into it to get some clarity. I drank a little. Dad always said running water was fine to drink from, and when something snapped not far behind me, I looked up like a zebra at a watering hole. I looked around, trying to find what was stalking me, but there was nothing, just the quiet forest and the gently rushing stream. No, I didn't believe that. I'd felt like I was stalked all day, and as I watched the trees, I felt sure that something moved out there. I got up and started running, the zebra analogy too hard to break, and I kept waiting for the claws to sink into me, the teeth to bite, the hot breath to fall on my neck. It was going to come at any minute. I could feel it, and when I tripped over a fallen log, I just lay there and waited for the end. It would get me now. It would get me, and I'd be dead. I'd be dead. Nothing happened. I lay there for about 10 minutes just knowing that it would get me when I moved, but it never came. When the ants started to bite my legs, I sat up and swiped at them. I'd fallen next to an anthill, and I had accidentally stomped on it in my haste, and they were mad as hell about it. I ended up going back to the creek to wash them off, a haphazard trip that took me another 10 minutes, and I was still looking around like a scared animal. I sat with my legs in the creek until they had stopped throbbing, and then made my miserable way back to camp. It was not as much fun walking back as it had been walking out, and I was jittery and tense the whole way. The sun was starting to slip down, and I absolutely didn't want to be out here when it got dark. Too many things could be crunching around out here in the dark. I made it back to camp before it got dark, and as I cooked my dinner, the sun started to ride low again. It was more hot dogs tonight, cooked over the fire, but I couldn't finish all of them. I was too scared to look away from the ridge, and I ended up burning more than one of them. They tasted fine either way, but I had eyes only for the shadows on the ridge. They had the same wide-brimmed hats. A few of them had canes, but none of them were really people. They were like shadows, the images burned at Hiroshima, the photo negatives that sometimes get burned into old photographs. All of them at once, and none of them at all. They just stood there, watching me. They didn't move. They didn't stir. And as the sun sank, I became colder and colder. I should have gone to my truck and left, but I didn't. I made myself put it out of my mind. I convinced myself that I was just being foolish. When it got dark, I got in my hammock and tried to get comfortable, but it wouldn't come. My leg hurt. I was sunburnt. I was hungover. I was dehydrated. I was, but ultimately, I was afraid. I was afraid that when I closed my eyes, they would get me. I was afraid they would just carry me off into the night and I'd never be seen again. They would find my truck and my campsite, but never me. Maybe, I thought as I finally nodded off, someone would look up one afternoon at sunset and see me on that ridge too, just watching. I must have fallen asleep, and I like to think I dreamed what came next. I want to, but I can't convince myself that I did. I woke up and saw them standing around me. I could see them, and not just the ones in front of the fire. They were darker than the night itself somehow, and they began to creep closer to me. Crept is the wrong word, though. They slid along the ground like ghosts in some of the horror movies I'd watched as a kid. They hemmed me in, my body shaking, but my voice stuck in my throat. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare speak. And as they knelt around me, I heard whispering. It was a terrible sound, and it follows me into sleep sometimes. You come here to the womb of creation and leave your waste. You are a brainless creature fit only to destroy things made by your betters. You burn the wood of a creature who has existed before you were more than a twinkling in your father's eye. You destroy a place that was new when this planet cooled. You throw your trash into a home shared by 100 billion organisms, and you claim to be superior here. The better. You are nothing. You will die and be forgotten. On and on and on, they whispered endlessly to me, telling me how worthless I was, how I was a nuisance and a nothing, and how I would never change. Then, one of them rose up above my hammock, his body seeming to hang over me, like a shadow cast from above. He looked like them, but he was clearly their boss or something, and when he brought the cane down on nothing but air, I heard it crack like a thunderbolt. Go back to your stinking pit, but be warned. The next time you come to our woods and ruin our place, you will not be allowed to scamper off so easily. You are a stunted thing who was taught badly, but ignorance is forgivable. If you persist in this folly, we will not be so kind again. Now go, it yelled, and I opened my eyes to find that it was morning. I was laying in my hammock, piss dribbling down my leg, and I knew that I better not be here when the sun came up. I cleaned up everything. I picked up all my garbage. I cleaned up my site. I poured water over the fire and mixed it with dirt like they had always said to on TV. Then I took everything with me, and I ran for the truck. That was Sunday, and I've been kind of afraid to leave my apartment. What if they're waiting out there for me? What if they find me slipping, or they don't like that I don't recycle or something like that? What if I offend them and they drag me back to the woods to be punished? That's part of why I'm writing this. If you're like me, someone who doesn't care about their mess or just leaves the woods wrecked, then watch out. Don't let the Dark Watchers catch you messing up their forest, because they do more than just watch. Don't let them see you slipping, or you might find out what sort of punishment awaits those who anger them. What a great start, and it even helps us stay in a summer mood as we move on to our next story. Coming right up, we have a story about a girl whose obsessions are a little couch potato-ier than most. However, she discovers that the things on the TV, the shadows on her entertainment, are more than happy to show her how real they can be. So let's hear a story about Darkhaven. "Rachel, are you sitting right in front of that television again?" came her mother's high, reedy voice from the kitchen. "No," Rachel called back, her voice incredulous, as if her mom would just assume something like that. Like she'd just hear the TV, always television to her, and always in the tone of deepest scorn, and assume that Rachel was sitting 5 feet from it. In truth, it would have likely been easier to split the atom than slide a piece of notebook paper between Rachel's face and the murky glow of the old television set. Like most of the children who had reached the age of 10 in this time of technological marvels, Rachel found her entire world balanced within the glow of that box. In it were held the 500 TV channels of her life: sports, cartoons, news, cartoons, current events, cartoons, and the scary movies that her mother would have had a fit if she knew she were watching. Rachel quickly spooled the channels through to the 5 or 6 that showed scary movies, being careful to move the volume down to 2 little green bumps that would ensure her mother didn't hear the TV. Her mother would have an absolute coronary if she knew Rachel was watching anything that wasn't approved family television by the Council for Moral and Ethical Values. Even in her head, Rachel always assumed this name was delivered in a reedy, nasal voice of a cultured and obviously boring old man. The whole town was like that, so caught up in their own ancient sense of what was right and wrong that they didn't seem to understand that times were changing. It was like Burrow was caught in the 50s sometimes. All the kids in town lived on their TVs. It was just a way of life. She spooled through the TV guide and saw that 3 movies were playing later that she wanted to see. Carrie was playing at 10:30, but that was much too soon. Her mother might be good and asleep by 11, but not by 10:30. The other channel, however, was showing Child's Play at 10:30, followed by something called Darkhaven. As she read the description, she knew that Darkhaven was the one she wanted to see tonight. The description sounded pretty cool, and it promised a true scare not often found in modern horror. The runtime was just over an hour, too, so even if her mom woke up at 2, as she was sometimes wont to do, she could easily be back in bed and well asleep before. "And what is this?" Rachel squeaked a little, and the remote clattered to the floor. Batteries rolled hither and thither as the back cover came off, and she turned her head to see her mother hovering over her. Rachel's mother wasn't an unattractive woman, but the worry lines and stress a pair of jobs brought on her had worn her down before her time. She now stood, legs spread in a linebacker's blocking stance, with her thick blonde hair thrown hastily into a messy tail, and her hands covered in the remains of tonight's dinner dish suds. Her face wasn't set cruelly, despite what Rachel thought. She'd never once seen anything more than parental displeasure from her mother. She was wearing the stern look she reserved just for Rachel, though, it seemed. "Nothing," Rachel said again. Just trying to give herself nightmares for the next 500 years. She said as she bent down and pushed the button on the front of the TV. It went off with a little staticky smack sound that reduced it to nothing but a dumb, lifeless box. "Off to bed now. It's well past your bedtime. The idea that I'd allow such filth in my—" But Rachel had listened to just about as much as she cared to of that. She'd frozen on the bottom step like a ballet dancer, preparing for her opening move. And what an opening move this was likely to be. "They aren't filth, Mother. I happen to like horror movies. If you weren't so close-minded, maybe you'd find out that you like them too." Her mother's stern face had flushed red at that, the deep scarlet it always turned before the two had one of their more and more common arguments. "Don't you dare take that short tone with me, young lady. This is still my house, and as long as you live in my house, you will follow my rules, and you can forget about TV for 2 days because of your sass." Rachel was affronted. But that's not fair. What am I supposed to do for 2 days? There's nothing else to do in this stupid town. No one ever wants to play outside or come over to visit. They all just want to watch TV. "Well, for 2 days, I guess you won't be one of them. Maybe you can be the first one to actually go out, and why don't you just admit it? Why don't you just admit that you hate me? Why don't you just admit that you love making my life miserable?" A silence hung between them for a minute. Rachel was walking down a dark path, but she didn't care. She knew that what she would do next would hurt her mother, hurt her worse than she'd ever hurt her before, but she didn't care. "And just where did you get an idea like that? Why would I hate you? Her mother's voice was incredulous and low, as though it was all she could do to breathe out the words. "I heard you once, talking to Mrs. Dempsey, talking about all the things you'd do if only you didn't have children. All the exciting things the two of you would do if only you didn't have children at home to take care of. Well, why don't you just go and do them? Because I honestly wish that I didn't have a mother." She didn't even stop to see how deeply she had wounded her. She stormed upstairs and slammed her door shut between herself and the whole stupid world. She came awake all at once and looked over at the clock on her bedside table. 11:30 p.m. She couldn't believe she'd dozed off. What if she'd missed it? She'd already had to miss Child's Play thanks to her mother's stupid racket. She rolled away from the clock and couldn't help feeling sorry for her mother. She'd expected another fight, a longer punishment maybe. She might have even sassed her way into what her friends called a spanking, which her mother had never believed in. Instead, she'd just cried. Rachel had heard her climb the stairs from underneath her covers and was sure that the door would open any minute. Her mother would come storming in with a belt or a paddle or maybe even just her hand and a still glowering rage at her cheeky daughter. But instead, she just went to bed. She'd opened her door and flopped out onto the big bed she'd once shared with Rachel's father before he left, and began to cry. Rachel couldn't remember ever hearing her mother cry, not even when she was 3. Her father had left, saying it just wasn't working out. He didn't love Rachel's mother anymore, and hadn't even bothered to say anything to Rachel. For the better part of an hour, her mother had sobbed furiously, choked anguished sobs that she didn't think would ever end, at least until she'd heard them change into deep, rhythmic snores. This had been at about 10:05, but Rachel hadn't dared to sneak down to the TV. Her mother could be shamming, though Rachel didn't think she was. Rachel didn't want to risk missing the movie she really wanted to see because she had been too hasty. She'd seen Child's Play about 100 times anyway, and had decided to close her eyes just for a second when 11:35 p.m. She'd sneak down to the living room in about 20 minutes, just to make sure that her mother was still good and asleep. No sense spoiling it now by being overeager. She rolled over, and her guilt rolled with her. She shouldn't have said that to her mom. It wasn't fair, and thinking about it now, her mother probably meant nothing by it. Whose mother didn't want a life where they didn't have responsibilities or children? Rachel was mature enough to understand that, but 11:38 p.m. But it was still a rotten thing to say. Rachel was here, and her mother thinking that way made her feel like she didn't care whether she lived or died. And she was always such a bother anyway. "Rachel, clean your room. Rachel, finish your vegetables. That's not appropriate subject matter for a child your age, Rachel." What did she know anyway? Who was she to judge what was and wasn't right for her to do? 11:39 p.m. Rachel rolled over angrily, and now time was being slow on purpose. She listened closely again and could still hear her mother's deep snoring from the other room. She could probably sneak down right now and catch the climactic ending of Child's Play. Her mother would never be the wiser. But no, Rachel wouldn't spoil it for a bad slasher flick ending that she'd seen 100 times. She'd bide her time until 11:41 p.m. She was sure that she could sneak down and not get caught. She felt her eyes getting heavy again and stifled a yawn. She would not get tired and fall asleep. That was not an option. She lasted this long, and she would last a little longer. She'd have to make sure she didn't fall asleep on the couch or something, like that one time a few months ago. Luckily, her mom hadn't woken up till nearly 7 after the storm had knocked the power out. The TV had been off, and all she'd been able to yell at her for was not waking her up and falling asleep on the couch. Oh, but hadn't that been a good night? Watching Ether Man during a rainstorm, and having to stifle a scream when the lightning had peeled out just as the knife slash had landed. 11:43 p.m. Rachel threw the covers off angrily. If time wasn't going to cooperate, then she'd just go ahead and risk it. She pulled on her fluffy pink slippers and her black bathrobe for night sneaking, and opened the door to her room carefully. It gave 1 or 2 traitorous squeaks, but they were small ones. Her mother's breathing never altered in the least. She slunk carefully into the hallway, past her mother's door, and down the steps as she tried hard to avoid the loose 8th step. Finally, she was down in the living room. She flipped on the TV and was bathed instantly in its warm, staticky glow. It was on the right channel, too. Child's Play was just ending, the credits beginning to roll, and the volume was still at the right level for night watching. She reclined against the couch as she waited for the letters to glide slowly to an end. She folded over herself and took a pillow off the couch to rest her head against. As the last name spilled sluggishly by, the screen lit up with a short infomercial about stock in a growing business firm. She flipped on the info button and read the description of Darkhaven again. As the smiling cowboy-hatted speaker finally delivered his tagline, "So put your trust in smiling Walter Rigsby, and you'll see the returns growing like our condos." Then the screen went eerily dark for what felt like hours. When it lit again, it was panning in on a dark forest, probably one in New England or Maine, and Rachel was accosted by the creepy circus grind of the intro music. She sighed. She couldn't believe she'd be missing TV for 2 days because of a slop-budget late 70s B-movie. The production value looked shoddy, even to a 10-year-old, and the camera work looked like some guy with a camcorder had shot it. She shrugged. Might as well see how it played out. It was only an hour and change anyway. The story started slow. Some settlers on a boat were in a bad storm, one of those Christopher Columbus specials with masts and lots of wood. A man on board was writing to his wife about how he missed her and wished she'd come with him to the new colony. There was some flashbacks, him arguing with some other buckle hat guy and asking some others to leave with him. Then a guy burst into his cabin and told him he was needed on deck. The following scene had been a little cool. Some of the men that came up to help had been washed overboard as they tried to save the ship. The actors were doing a pretty good job of drowning as the boat sailed away, unable to rescue them, though they were certainly trying with all they had. It got boring again pretty quick after they landed. Lots of farming, lots of good morrows and banter. There was one old woman they seemed to think was a witch, but they left her alone instead of burning her like they usually did in these types of movies. Rachel was starting to nod off when an Indian came into town one day, accompanied by some equally as unbelievably white-looking Indians. He told the letter writer, who was their mayor or leader or something, that they had settled on sacred ground to the local tribe, and that they would have to move the town or suffer the Indians' wrath. This led to a good little stretch of Indians returning nightly to burn their houses and kill people. Believably kill people, too. When one Indian brave buried his tomahawk in one of the settlers, she wasn't honestly sure she could see the effects that made the blood splatter. The scalping looked pretty grisly, too, as did the horse dragging and the execution of the braves they caught during the attack. This progressed until the people of the village had gathered to try to find a way to stop the Indians from attacking Darkhaven. The Indians had called it Darkhaven in their native tongue, and so some of the settlers had taken to calling it that too. Rachel was interested by this point. The movie had turned out to be not only very gory, but also very grabbing. She couldn't remember why it had been boring before. Suddenly, every character seemed more than real, and every death was as real as it would have been if it had been one of her own family members. The village's salvation came from an unexpected source. The old witch woman turned out to have a book that told her how to call forth a terrible power. "He will crush the savages," she told them, "in exchange for a pure soul." The townspeople then, with little to no discussion it seemed, rushed out to find a virgin, despite the protests of their leader and the local priest. Rachel sat close, a paper's breadth between her and the TV. They took a young woman and strapped her to the ground. The old witch cackled as she drew around the sobbing girl in the dirt, and the woman screamed and writhed as she pulled at her chains. She begged them to release her, tears pouring down her face as the old hag began to work her magic. The townspeople, for their part, mostly just stood around and looked somber and embarrassed. They didn't seem to know what to do here, and as the witch's spell began, many seemed to have second thoughts. It was too late, though. The drawing in the dirt began to glow painfully bright, and thrum in a dark crystalline purple that made Rachel squint. The woman screamed and screamed as the black ooze spilled from the ground. The ooze rolled over her dress, up her legs, and slid into her mouth with... The scene suddenly turned to snow. Signal lost. "No!" Rachel howled, throwing a hand over her mouth a second later to stifle the furious scream that would have followed. She began to pound her fist on the glass eye that so cruelly cheated her. She began to scream as loud as she dared at this hateful little monster of glass and plastic. She hated it. It built her up, and then snatched her prize away at the last minute. She hated it so much she... Her hand made a wet sound as she struck the screen. She pulled her fist back and looked down at the darkened surface. What was that? She held it to the salt and pepper snow of the television and looked in confusion at the dark liquid on her fist. Was that mud? Is her hand covered in... Good God! As she looked down at the slick substance on the underside of her curled fist, it writhed and pulled away from her skin slightly. No, it was a trick of the light. It had to be. It had to be blood or something. She'd burst a vessel, slamming her stupid hand against the TV. That had to be it. It couldn't... Plop. She looked up. Plop. Something was falling out of the TV. Plop. Plop. Was it her blood? There seemed to be an awful lot of it. It pooled on the carpet before her eyes, coming out in rivulets from the staticky eye. It soaked into the thick tangle of shaggy carpet, and Rachel scuttled crab-like away from it. One huge piece fell from the center of the snow. It's quivering. It's beating, Rachel thought. She didn't know why she thought this until something solid floated to the top of the pool. It rolled drunkenly in the murk, and as it rolled, it began to pulsate, to throb, to send little ripples out from the pulsating mass. It was a heart. The goop began to move, congealing, and then lifting itself up bonelessly like a waterspout from the world's darkest puddle. It hung there looking at her as it studied her scared face. Though it had no eyes, she knew it looked. She felt her breath coming in stuttering skips as she stared into the scariest thing she had ever seen in her whole life. It wavered like the jello her mother sometimes made for dessert. Then one thin leg broke from the black surge and took a liquid step towards her. She was over the couch in a flash and watched as it buckled and fell juicily against the coffee table, full of old art books her mother had lovingly kept there. It splattered and covered the chintzy farmscape, but then drew itself back together quickly as it began to assume a more human form. Its arms and legs were too thin, its torso like one of those department store mannequins she'd seen in Woolworth's, and its head was a vague oval with a sleek, featureless face. But still, she knew. It saw her. Her fear grabbed her fully, but unlike most children, her fear always transferred into flight. She took to the stairs 3 at a time. She drove through her bedroom door and slammed it shut behind her. It rattled and buckled not a heartbeat later, and came open with a monstrous crunch. She was thrown like a rag doll across the room and onto her own bed. The creature was inside, already lunging towards her. It tripped on those 2 thin legs, though, and one of them connected with her beanbag chair. She leapt over it. She was out of her room again, slamming the door shut behind her as the creature gained its feet again. She ran to her mother's room, her fists sounding like cannon shots as she banged frantically on the door. "Mom! Mommy! Please! Help me!" Her mother, dressed in the same rumpled clothes she'd come home in, threw the door open, brandishing a long wooden bat as she came into the hallway. She looked left, looked right, and then dropped panting to clutch at Rachel. "Honey? Rachel, what's wrong?" "A man, a thing, it's in my room, it's... But then she realized with real terror that it hadn't followed her. Something that quick should have been through the door and after her in a heartbeat. She looked back at the closed door, and dread began to coil there. Why hadn't it come after her? Rachel's mother looked at the door, and then pushed her daughter behind her. "I'll go have a look. You stay here. Call 911 if something happens." "No, Mom, please. Please don't leave me. Let's go call them now, and they can..." But she was down the hall, and to the door faster than the creature could have even managed. Her mother put herself against the wall like a SWAT cop preparing to burst into a drug house. She brought her foot up and kicked the door, and Rachel cringed and closed her eyes, expecting the thing to leap on her mother in 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. No screaming, no yelling, nothing. She opened her eyes and saw her mother walking around the room, checking in the closet, looking under the bed, behind the furniture. She had turned on the lights, and with it, it didn't seem half so scary as it had a minute ago. Her mother swept the entire room 3 times, baseball bat at the ready, but after the 3rd time, she shrugged and turned back to her still shivering daughter. "Well, no boogeymen, Rachel, no monsters, no shadows, but I did find this little creature waiting patiently for you to stumble over him." She held out a well-worn teddy that Rachel had had since she was a baby. She'd put it on top of her closet. It seemed childish to have something like that on her bed at her age, but she was honestly glad to see it now. Her mother smiled and took a step towards the door. "Look who doesn't need a mother now, huh?" she said, not in her snippy ha-ha voice, but in her warm mother voice Rachel had heard less and less of these days, and would never hear again. Before she made it halfway to the threshold, the light on her table popped off with a smell like burning plastic. Rachel's mother turned to look at it, her face now cut in half by the darkness. but only Rachel saw the thin sliver of darkness that wrapped lovingly around her ankle. Her mother registered it a moment before it went taut as a noose, and Rachel saw a sad mix of terror, regret, and savage resolve to fight anything that threatened her child. Surprise and bemusement at the thought of being so vulnerable in her own home snap across her mother's face. "Rachel," she said, before she was dragged bonelessly to the floor and pulled, hardwood ribbons rising from her fingernails, under the bed. The baseball bat made a queer hollow plink as it hit the floor, a heartbeat before that ragged old bear. By then, though, her mother had disappeared an eternity ago to her daughter's eyes, into the inky blackness beneath her bed. The door slammed, and Rachel was left alone in the hallway. "Are you comfy? Could you use a little more of something to drink? I'm sure I've got some water or some soda in there, if you're not thirsty for coffee. I drink it by the bucket these days, no matter the weather, so I guess it's just ingrained." Coming up next, we have a story about someone who buys something that excites them, and discovers a shadowy world that they can only see in the colors of their new bulb. So, let's hear a story about the colors of fear. When I came home from work and saw the package on the front porch, I was filled with an irrational flood of joy. You would have thought I'd received something spectacular, and to me, I had. I'd been waiting for 5 days for Amazon to send the package, and as I brought it inside and cut the tape, I couldn't wait to see how it looked. Reaching into the buffer pads, I pulled out not a game or a new Funko Pop, but a single light bulb in a package that seemed bigger than it should have needed to be. Not just any light bulb, however, but one of those color-changing LED light bulbs. I'd seen them on TikTok and thought they looked cool. They would go through a whole spectrum of colors, thanks to the little remote they came with, and I thought the whole operation looked very soothing. I like to watch people lay in bed as the colors shifted, and I thought it might help with my recent mood. I'd been experiencing some heavy seasonal depression lately, and the inclusion of some colored lights might be just what I was missing. I read the instructions and installed the bulb in my ceiling fan, and smiled as I looked at the little remote in my hand. There were so many colors to choose from, and I felt a giddy sense of anticipation. Which one should I try first? Red? Maybe blue? I settled on a light and buttery yellow as I lay in my bed. I felt like I was in some kind of sun, the ones I'd drawn as a kid, it seemed. The yellows were thick, the shade of melted crayons, and I was happy as I lay beneath it in my single room. It had been hard to get out in the cold lately, and this made me feel like I was at the park, under the warm sun at the beach, maybe. It wasn't actually warm, but I could trick my mind into thinking that it was, at least. I lay there for a few minutes, just soaking up the faint sunlight, before I got up and went to my computer. As I logged into World of Warcraft for a little gaming, I looked at the remote and decided on a different color. As I explored in the game, I changed the colors to depend on where I was going. The rusty red of Orgrimmar, the deep green of Stranglethorn, the light blue of the Undercity, back to the sunny yellow for the Barrens, and so on and so on. The bulb had a color for every occasion, it seemed, and I really enjoyed playing with it as the evening progressed. I fell asleep that night under the soft, dark blue of a night sky, and I slept better than I had in a long time. In my downtime the following week, I found myself playing with the light, trying out the different colors. I discovered a button for mixing colors, and found myself making color combinations that turned my room into all kinds of different shades. I found I liked a few of them. The blue and green combination reminded me of the undersea videos I'd seen on Discovery Channel when I was a kid. There was a red and yellow of the deep desert, the purple-blue of icy peaks, and I found myself lying in bed some evenings after work and just trying different combinations. I fell asleep on Thursday night, the soft blue and deep purple making me think of glaciers, and woke up to a nightmare. I opened my eyes and found myself floating in a room that looked smeared with blood. The walls seemed to hold strange shadows, the reds and blacks mingling like filth in a morgue. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst were the creatures. They were dirty white that was almost translucent, their eyes like lamps as they stared at my prone form. I wasn't sure what to make of them at first, and I wondered if I was dreaming. If I was, this was the most realistic dream I had ever had. Their bodies were long and narrow, like pale reeds, and other than their eyes, they seemed devoid of features. There were two of them, one in the corner by my desk and the other perched in the junction of the ceiling and wall. We stared at each other for some undeterminable amount of time, and I was nearly convinced that I was actually dreaming when my phone chirped and lit up on the nightstand. All three of us looked at the light, and when I looked back at them, the one in the corner of the ceiling had dropped soundlessly onto the floor. The skin around the bottom of his head seemed to rip open to reveal a double row of buttery yellow teeth. His fellow creature did the same, and as the two stalked closer to me on their noodly-looking arms, I whimpered and reached for the bat that I kept beside my bed. As I turned, I must have rolled over on the remote. As the bulb changed back to the same buttery yellow I had basked in on the first day, I came up with the bat out in front of me to find the room devoid of nightmare creatures. I turned it back to the normal fluorescence and looked around in a panic, trying to figure out what had just happened. I was still awake when the sunrise lit the windows, and I wasn't sure I'd ever sleep again with the image of those creatures thumping around in my head. I tried to get about my morning routine, getting ready for work and getting breakfast together, but the image of those horrible things would never leave me. They followed me through my day, dogging my steps as I tried to get my work done, but by lunch, I was a mess. When my boss saw me in the break room, my shaking hands struggling to open my lunch bag, she told me I looked ill and said I should go home and get some rest. "You look ill, dear. Take the day off and have a good weekend. We'll see you Monday." I told her that wasn't necessary, but she insisted. I was grateful for the chance to get some rest, but I found my anxiety growing as I got home, the same place I had seen those horrors. I checked the corners where I had seen them, hoping to find some sign that it had just been a dream, and I was rewarded with nothing. There were no marks on the eggshell white walls, no signs of claws or dirt from the filthy skin of the creatures, but it did little to soothe me. Sign or not, I knew I hadn't been dreaming, and that meant that these things had to be real. The idea that I couldn't see them, that they only existed in the dark, was even more terrifying. But despite my fears, the need to find out what they were and how they had disappeared without any sign just wouldn't leave me. I started by just turning off the lights, but I didn't think that would do much good. I'd woken up in the dark plenty of times, and I'd never seen anything like those creatures. No, I thought, it had to have something to do with that light that I had seen covering the walls. It had changed when I rolled onto the remote, and whatever combination I had bumped had allowed me to see the creatures. I knew about things that you couldn't see with the naked eye, things that were too small or hard to see outside the right color spectrum, and I wondered if these creatures were like that. More importantly, if I could only see them in that spectrum, then was it a two-way street? Could they only see me when that spectrum was on? Might explain why they didn't attack me otherwise. I didn't want to see them. The thought of looking at them terrified me, but I was curious as well. The thought of them followed me as surely as the creatures might, and I needed to be sure of what they were. I was no scientist, not by a long shot, but my desire for answers was greater than my self-preservation in this case. I started playing with different color combinations on the remote, my bat always at the ready. Before you ask, I tried red and black, but gave me something like a desert cave more than anything. The remote was small, but if you held the buttons, the colors would change further. They would get darker or lighter. They might even change depth and perception, and the combinations really were vast. My computer sat untouched that weekend, my books and TV left to catch dust, and by Sunday, I was a mess. Hadn't slept much that weekend. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see were the faces of the monsters that stalked me, and my rest was pretty thin. When someone knocked on my door, I jumped and looked around fitfully. I peeked down the hallway as someone knocked again, and when Debbie called my name, I realized it wasn't the monsters trying to trick me out of my little cocoon. I didn't even realize I wasn't dressed for company until I made it to the door. I was in clothes that my mother would have called grubs, and my hair was loose and unwashed. I likely smelled. I hadn't showered since Friday morning, and was extremely self-conscious as I opened the door to my apartment. Debbie smiled, bundled up against the cold, and when she saw the state of me, she came right in and asked what was wrong. "Wendy said you had been sent home on Friday with some kind of illness, and I see why now. You look terrible. It's not the COVID, is it?" she said, pulling her scarf up over her nose and mouth. "No, I'm not actually sick," I admitted. "Then what's going on? Have you been sleeping okay? Here." She took egg drop soup out of a bag and set it on the couch. "I brought you your favorite sick soup to help you get past this." I smiled, realizing that I hadn't eaten since the night before, when that delicious steam hit my nose. Bless her. Debbie was a true friend. As we sat, Debbie had brought dumplings to go along with the soup. I told her about the weird creatures that I had seen. Unlike me, Debbie looked excited at the prospect of seeing something different. Debbie was into things like ghost hunting and cryptids, and she loved the idea of actually getting to see one. "Oh my gosh, you gotta let me help. Come on, we'll have a picnic in your room. If this is making you sick, I want to help you see it through." I was glad for her help, but I didn't want to get her caught up in the same crap I was likely getting caught up in. Debbie was my best friend, and the thought of the creature getting her too, all thanks to my damn curiosity, was something I would rather avoid. Debbie, however, was not taking no for an answer. We took the food to my room, and I showed her the remote and the bulb. Debbie scratched her chin as she looked at the buttons, asking if I was sure it was red and black, as she started working through the settings. When I woke up, it was definitely red and black, but it was different. It was greasy looking, ethereal, not quite real. It was like a dream. That's why it took me so long to realize I was awake. Debbie started changing the colors in quick succession, the colors dancing as they went through the spectrum. I was afraid she would burn it out, the colors changing too quickly for my liking, but she just shook her head at me. She said it was fine. They were meant to sustain these kinds of things, and it would speed it up if she just kept flipping through. So we sat there, eating and flipping the lights at an almost nauseating pace for the next few hours. The sun went down and the moon came up, and as I lay on the bed and played on my phone, I realized it was almost midnight suddenly. I had to go back to work the next day, and I told Debbie I needed to get to bed. "Look, I appreciate your help, but I've got to be up early in the morning." Just a little more," Debbie said, the lights still dancing by. I know I can do it." I rolled over and shook my head, reaching for the remote. "Look, I appreciate your help, but I just don't think it can be done." She moved a little away, still flipping through the colors as I reached, and as I came off the bed, she scuttled a little further back. "Come on, just a little longer. You can be a little tired tomorrow in exchange for a good night's sleep, right?" "No, Debbie, I'm tired. I need to..." I grabbed the remote, Debbie pulling back, and that's when it fell over us. I don't know how, but we were both suddenly enveloped in the aura of dirty red and black light. The walls oozed like fresh blood. The dark hung around them like smog, and I was suddenly aware that we weren't alone. There were more than two this time, their numbers nearly a dozen, as they clung to the walls and the ceiling, like grisly insects. Debbie's mouth hung open, her scream stuck midway up her throat, and I realized this had likely not been what she was expecting. As their mouths split their faces, their teeth huge, my hands shook and my stomach dropped. They fell on us then, and I rolled under the bed without thinking. Debbie's scream came out, loud and strong, and I pulled my knees to my chest as I tried to think about what to do. They were killing her. They were killing my best friend, and the only thing I could think of was changing the lights back. It had worked the first time. Maybe it would work now. I looked around, finding the remote on the ground, but as I reached for it, I saw the giant yellow eyes find me. One of those noodly arms came reaching for me, and as my fingers found the plastic face, I pushed the first button I could find and snatched it away from the sharp teeth of the creature. The light turned to something like normal before it popped loudly, and I was left in darkness. I got out my phone and switched on the flashlight, looking around and finding nothing but the ruined remains of our picnic. By the light of my phone, I discovered that the creatures were gone, but I also discovered that Debbie was gone, too. I've ordered another light bulb, but it won't arrive until tomorrow. I paid for express shipping, but I don't know if that'll be soon enough to save Debbie. I don't want to see those things ever again, but if there's a chance that Debbie's still alive, I have to find her. She wanted to help me, and now it's my turn to try and help her. So be careful with your new light bulbs if you buy one. You may see more than you bargained for, and you may lose more than just the cost of shipping. Man, it's a scorcher out here today. But the stories, at least in my opinion, wouldn't be nearly as good without the crackling fire to backdrop it for us. Let's hear a story about second chances, about losing those second chances, and about finding something that you might have never thought you'd find. Let's hear a little story about the black spot. I won't go back to work tomorrow. I don't care what Jack says and how much he threatens to tell my probation officer. I will not hear the way my coworkers laugh at me. They tell me it's nothing, but they didn't see what I saw. They haven't seen the spot like I did today. Yeah, I did a little time. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not going to bullshit anybody and tell them a lie. I got a little too drunk one night and assaulted someone in a bar. It was my first offense, and I did my 2 years without much hassle. Hell, they even let me do the last year at work release, so I could keep paying my parents' mortgage for them. I have experience in construction, so it was a good fit. They set me up with a crew, doing drywall and laying flooring, and I worked for a good bunch of guys. It was a sweet gig, and it was a gig I was told I could keep after I got released. On the day I was released, I told them I'd see them in a few days and rejoin the real world. That, however, was the night my dad suffered a stroke. It was a bad one. Mom woke me up screaming, and we took him to the hospital in the back of an ambulance. Suddenly there were doctors to talk to, changes to make to the house I'd grown up in, and a man who'd once taken care of me to take care of. He'd lost function in nearly half his body, and with Mom feeling very overwhelmed, it became my job to take care of Dad. It wasn't until my probation officer informed me that I was in danger of violating my probation that I realized it had been almost a month since I'd been released. I understand that you've got some things going on, but you have to maintain employment as part of your probation. Your job with a construction firm says that they'll let you come back if you're still interested, but you have to have some income coming in by next week or risk violating your probation and going back to prison. I went to the foreman the next day to see if I could get my old job back, but it appeared I was in for a surprise. Yeah, sorry, we filled your spot on that crew. We didn't know if you were coming back, and we needed a full crew for the job. I gritted my teeth and resist the urge to rage at him. "Then why did you tell the probation officer I could come back?" "'Cause I have a new crew for you, if you're still interested in it." I told him I was, and he gave me a number to call. "That's Jack. He's been begging for another able body. Give him a call and see if you guys can meet up today." I thanked him, inwardly fuming that he'd already filled my position, and called the number. Jack answered on the third ring and told me that his crew left at 5 a.m. If I wanted a spot on it, I'd better be on the yard at 5 a.m., ready to work. I told him I would, and he hung up on me mid-sentence. I already didn't have a good feeling about this guy. He was terse, and didn't sound like the kind of guy you wanted to have a beer with after work. Regardless, I needed the work, so I set my alarm the night before and dragged up before dawn to meet this asshole at the yard at 5 a.m. And oh boy, had I been right in my hunch about this guy. Jack was one of those average-sized dudes who thinks he's a giant, the kind of guy who gets his ass beat in prison. He wore jeans and a sleeveless t-shirt, with a gold chain that hung down into his thick chest hair. His hair was held in place with enough grease to change the oil in my car, and I saw him single me out the second I showed up. He had a small crew, maybe 10 guys, but the way he zoned in on me let me know that he'd been looking for me. Well, you actually showed up. Rick may speak highly of you, but I'm not just going to drop somebody down so some ex-con can have a job. You'll be cleaning the job site until I'm convinced that you're not going to show up high or just dip out in the middle of the day. If that's not okay with you, then you're going to go tell your probation officer to send you back where you came from." He turned and walked away, the crew piling into his truck as I stood there in stunned silence. I had to remind myself that I needed this job as I piled into the back of the truck with them. I had to remind myself a lot over the next few hours that Mom and Dad needed me home and not back in prison. We pulled up outside this dumpy-looking house in the suburbs just as the sun started to come up over the horizon. It was an old 2-story with a peeling exterior, and a yard that looked like it had last been mowed during the Bush administration. They had made a pathway up to the walk so that they could bring in their tools, and the grass looked stomped flat by the constant traffic. They had set up a generator near the porch, and a big metal dumpster created an island in the grass where they had just rolled it off and dropped it. All in all, it was a sloppy-looking sight, but I was in no position to throw stones. Jack collected us up on the porch so he could give out assignments. The old house was being renovated so the company could flip it, and he set several of us to ripping up carpet. After assignments were given, Jack and 3 others went upstairs to assess the damage, and I didn't see them come back until after lunch. I was set to pulling carpet in the downstairs living room. It was a dingy little room with a pair of small windows that reminded me of eyes. The carpet was disgusting, covered in hair and crumbs, and it was tacky like old soda had been spilled on it. I was sliding on my gloves when someone threw a crowbar on the floor and walked off. "Hey, aren't you going to help me?" I asked, but the guy who tossed the crowbar just shook his head. "We each get a room. This one's yours, so get to it." Then they left me to pull carpet in this big dirty room by myself. The living room wasn't huge, but it was still a lot to ask of one person. I pressed the crowbar in and pulled the carpet away from the wall, not bothering to be gentle. The drywall was going to be pulled out next, and I suddenly wondered why they were pulling the carpet out first. I shrugged. I wasn't the boss here, so I guess I'd just have to do as I was told. That was the first time I noticed the spot. It was in the corner of the living room, a big water stain that seemed to take up 2 walls. It was about the size of a basketball, and the water spot looked like it would be wet if you touched it. It kind of freaked me out, for some reason, though I couldn't tell you why at the time. As I worked, I could almost swear it was moving, just a little, and I got that feeling like eyes on the back of my neck. You know the feeling, the one that makes your hair prickle up, the one that makes you think you might be being watched. I tried not to let it bug me, but it was like I could feel that spot as I worked. The carpet didn't take too long. An hour later, I had rolled it up and was ready to haul it out. I looked around for help, but the others were still hard at it, or at least pretending to be. I could see 3 of them sitting around smoking or chatting for every one guy working. When I asked them to help me get the carpet out to the dumpster, they just scoffed and waved me off. I couldn't move it by myself, so I just left it in the living room and went to look for more carpet to pull. It seemed that my fellow workers weren't as diligent as I was, because there was still carpet in 3 rooms that seemed to need removing. I sighed. This was clearly going to be my life for a while, and I set to work pulling the carpet to get ready to haul it all out. As I worked in a bedroom, the wall painted off blue with stormy-looking clouds on it, I got the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned to the door, thinking maybe one of my coworkers had come to see who was making so much noise back here, but there was no one. I looked to the window, but it was so caked with dust that no one could have seen anything through it. I glanced over to the closet, thinking maybe someone was lurking in there, and that was when I saw the source of my discomfort. A basketball-shaped spot on the wall over the closet door. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It was just a water spot. The house was probably full of them, and I just happened to have found one that looked exactly like the other one I had seen. I kept working, pulling up tack strips in places, but it still felt funny, like something was watching me. As the carpet rolled up, I began to push it towards the door, sending up puffs of smoke as it thumped over. As I pushed, I couldn't help but glance at that spot. It was still there, hanging over the closet door, seeming to watch me as I worked. I turned to look at it squarely and gasped as I noticed a large white hole in the middle of the spot. Like an eye floating in a puddle. I ran out of the room then, bumping into another worker as I beat a hasty retreat. "There you are," he said tersely. "We've been looking for you. Come help us move this carpet." I was more than happy to oblige, anything to get out of that room, and we spent the rest of the morning hefting carpet. We pulled it to the dumpster, tossing it in haphazardly, and then assessed the work for tomorrow. As we broke for lunch, I had almost forgotten about the spot. People being around me made me feel a little crazy about being afraid of it, but as we worked, I could swear I saw it again and again. The walls were covered in stains. The pipes were likely bad, but this one was definitely the same spot. It had the same wobbly edges and deep, black center as the one I'd seen the first time. The white circle was gone, though, but I still found myself looking for it when I was in a room. The guys on the crew must have noticed because they started making jokes about how prison had made me jumpy. "He's got to check all the corners when he comes in to make sure no booty bandits are lurking," a big, slovenly one in overalls would say, and they'd all laugh like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. If I didn't need this job so bad, I'd have made something of it. We moved upstairs eventually, finding 2 bedrooms and a bathroom that needed carpet or flooring removed. By 5 o'clock, we had all the carpet out of the house and in the dumpster out front. Jack came back in a truck, handing out paychecks and thanking the guys for their hard work. When he came to me, he handed me the check grudgingly, scowling the whole time and holding it when I tried to take it from him. "Tomorrow I expect some real work out of you, not just half-assing it like you did today." I took the check and walked off. I'd find my own way back. The next day was a little better. Jack said that the drywall would come next, and then he and his cronies disappeared out to the truck while the rest of us worked. We all started tearing out drywall, dust and nails flying, and I meant to swing my hammer into that spot extra hard when I saw it. To my disappointment, though, the spot never showed up. I'd seen it everywhere yesterday, seen it in every room at least once, but today it was absent. We spent the day tearing out drywall and cleaning up after ourselves. When 5 o'clock came, we packed up and went out to get paid. Today had been better. Nothing builds camaraderie like a little hard work, and I found myself joining in on the jokes and conversation that happened in the group. We were covered in drywall dust as we walked out that afternoon, laughing about how Tony had been scared by a rat when it burst out of the drywall in the laundry room. Jack looked at them coldly, affronted that they had accepted me so easily. He handed me my check in silence, and I piled into the back of the truck with the others this time. The next day was the last day I'd get to work with them. We spent that day hanging drywall downstairs. Between the 10 of us, we worked diligently and quickly. The drywall went up a sheet at a time, something I was pretty good at, and I was glad to see it covered the hollow studs and the newly blown-out insulation. We marked a few spots where the beams were rotten, but the pipes actually looked pretty good, as did the electrical. I began to wonder what had made the spots I kept seeing. They looked so wet, but I pushed it out of my mind as I worked beside my newfound companions. By 5 o'clock, we'd done most of the downstairs, and we'd have the rest finished by tomorrow so we could move upstairs. When I walked out onto the porch, though, I realized I'd forgotten something. I had rubbed at my wrist, looking for the reassuring feel of metal that had gotten me through 2 years in the can, but I found only bare skin. My heart skipped a beat. My dad's watch was gone. When I remembered that I had laid it on the counter, not wanting it damaged while I was working, I must have forgotten all about it in the bustle. I grabbed my check and turned to go back in the house, Jack scowling at me as I walked off. "We're leaving," he called to my back, but I waved him off. "If you're gone when I get back, I'll just find my own way." I wasn't about to leave my watch here overnight. I went to the kitchen and checked the counter, but there was nothing there. It was powdery with dust from today's work, and I thought I could see an indent where the watch had been. I checked underneath the counters and around the floor, but I couldn't find my watch. I began to look around, hoping it hadn't found its way into someone else's pocket. I walked through the rooms, looking into each of them, to see if I'd maybe left it there, and when I looked into the living room, I was rewarded for my effort. Sitting in the dead center of the debris-riddled floor was my missing watch. I took a step, but something brought me up short. A little tickle on the back of my head told me that it was a little too convenient. It was like a trap baited with something for an unlucky animal to blunder into. I shook it off. I wanted my watch, damn it, and I wasn't going to just abandon it because I had a hinky feeling. I bent down to get it, wrapping my fingers around the cold metal, when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was pulsating, sludgy, something that I had seen soaking into the new drywall. I looked up exasperated, figuring that someone had put a nail through a pipe at some point today. But what I saw drew me up short. I was left half bent, filled with fear, as I saw the oozy black spot seething on the drywall. It was bigger than a basketball now, its inky depth seeming to beat like a heart. As I watched, I could see 2 white circles materializing out of the soup. They rolled around like lost eggs, and finally came to rest in the middle of the sludge. I wanted to run. I didn't want to see whatever was in that thing, but I was trapped like a deer in headlights. I felt my breath hitching in my chest, and could only wait for my legs to regain their strength. The white orbs rolled around in the soup and became eyes. They blinked at me, their centers trained on me as I bent there. All at once, a Cheshire cat smile floated under them as it beamed at me. I was stuck looking into that inky hole, the edges dribbling down the fresh drywall as it oozed and ran. Suddenly I was sure that part of that darkness was ahead with the eyes that were looking out at me from whatever inky void it inhabited, maybe with hands that wanted to pull me into that dark hole it inhabited. As if it had read my mind, I saw dark hands grip the edges of the spot, trying to pull itself out and enter my world. It never lost eye contact as it pulled itself out, and I could see the vague outline of its head as it came free of the spot with that placental pop. It was all I needed to see. Suddenly my legs were moving in overtime, my heart was racing like a steam engine, and I was out the door and slamming it behind me before I could quite remember how I had gotten onto the porch. Even through the blood pounding in my ears and the rubber of my sneakers pounding on the wooden floor, something else dominated my hearing, and there was one sound that I would never forget. I may not be able to remember how I came to be on the porch, heaving and gasping for air, but I do remember the sound I heard just before I threw the door open and I was free. It was a plop and a splatter, similar to a bucket of paint being emptied on the ground. I ran home, calling Jack as I took off up the sidewalk. He picked up on the second ring. "I'm not coming back for you. I told you that I was..." "Jack, you gotta get somebody back to the site. Someone's there." "Who?" Jack asked, and I could hear his skepticism. "If this is some kind of goof, I don't get it." I told him how I had gone back for my watch and I'd seen someone skulking about the site. I didn't tell him about the oozing hole in the wall. He'd see that. However, I did tell him that I had thought the guy might be on drugs, so he should probably be careful. He was banging his fists on the drywall, so I booked it, I finished, trying to keep it believable. The crew was just starting to warm up to me, and I didn't want them to think I was a nut job. "Jesus Christ, I thought you ex-cons were tough. I'll go have a look. You just stay home. I'll let you know what I find." That was hours ago. Since I got home, I've been in my room, waiting on Jack to call, and I decided to write this while I waited. When I opened my laptop, though, my desire to get this down became all the more prevalent. As I slid it open, I caught a glimpse behind me and realized that I'll be fortunate if I have time to finish this tale. I could see a basketball-sized hole reflected in the screen of my laptop. I got up and locked the door and moved my writing to the living room. I don't know if the locked door will stop whatever may come from that dribbling hole, but I know that it may give me enough time to finish this before it breaks the surface. Keep your eyes peeled for water spots. You never know what might come slipping out. One more story, and then I think that'll be it for me today. Let's see what we have left. Oh, one of those stories that usually gets me kicked off of no sleep. I think we're going to end today with a bit of, what's the word? Is it sad horror or, I guess, tragic horror? Let's hear a story about a husband and a wife, and about tragic loss, and about someone who's a shadow of her former self. It all started when my wife died 8 months ago. Susan was everything to me. We'd been together since high school, and it had been love at first sight. We married after graduation, and we spent 18 years together in wedded bliss. I worked as a writer, finding jobs in editing or column writing. Susan working as a receptionist for a friend of my mother's. We spent a lot of time together. My days spent mostly waiting for her to come home. I lived for the moments when we were sitting in front of the TV together or curled up in bed as we talked about our day. We never had children, though it wasn't for a lack of trying. I was afraid she would leave me when she discovered I was infertile. I'd been injured when I was small, but she just smiled and said we'd just have to be satisfied with each other. It was never something we struggled with. Instead of kids, we gave each other our full attention. We traveled as often as we could, ate out often, had date nights at least once a week, and loved each other more than anyone else we knew. Susan was my everything, and I hoped I was hers. She never gave me any doubt that it was so, and those 18 years were the happiest time of my life. They weren't enough, though. 1,000,000 years wouldn't have been enough. I was writing something for some rag that Susan liked to read when I got the call. She had looked over my shoulder that morning before she left, cooing appreciatively as I edited a piece from one of her favorite writers, other than me, of course. She wanted to read it when I was done, and I promised I'd let her see it when she got home. I'd been invited to write a column, too, something they might let me do more often if it did well, and I'd just started fleshing it out when I decided it was time for a second cup of coffee. The coffee maker was burbling happily, filling my mug with liquid happiness, when my phone rang. Thought it might be Susan, letting me know she had made it to work, and I almost didn't answer when I saw it was an unknown number. The telemarketers had been particularly bad lately. And the last thing I wanted was another conversation with someone who wanted to sell me solar panels or extend the warranty on my car. Turned out it was the police. There'd been an accident. They were sorry, but she had passed very quickly, likely instantly, and hadn't felt any pain. My cup smashed as it hit the floor, soaking my feet in hot coffee as I gripped the counter for support. I would need support for the next few months. I was a wreck. My wife had been my whole world, and suddenly I was alone. I couldn't even go into the bedroom for the first 2 weeks. It smelled like her. Her pictures were everywhere. I slept on the couch a lot those days. I didn't even go in there to get my suit. I just bought a new one off the rack for the funeral. It was small. Neither of us had a lot of friends or family, but the girls from the doctor's office were very supportive, very sorry to lose such a dear friend. We buried her in Mountain Hills, a cemetery not far from the house. After they lowered her into the ground, I just sat there, trying to figure out what to do. I was still sitting there when the guys from the funeral home came to pick up the chairs, the sun setting behind me as I watched the hole in the ground where my wife now lay. "Sorry for your loss, mister, but we gotta pack these up now." I just got up and drove home, finding myself sitting on the couch. When the sun came up, it was still sitting there. This became a pattern. The next 2 months are kind of a blur, honestly. I lived my life like that quote from Forrest Gump. When I was tired, I slept. When I was hungry, I ate. And when I had to go, I went. I really didn't leave the house unless I had to, and when I did, I walked. I didn't trust cars after that, and I'm still not comfortable riding in anything with wheels. The walks probably did me good, but I was so lost at that point in my life. She'd been my everything, my whole world, and I just didn't know how to get by without her. I didn't work. My contracts quickly dried up. I wasn't working on my book either, and I'd fallen into a deep funk. If something hadn't pulled me out, I would have probably wasted away right there. Luckily, I suppose, something did. That was when the gifts started showing up. The first one came on Valentine's Day, though I now know that was no accident. I had stepped out in the evening to check the mail, and there it was on the stoop. I almost stepped on it, and that would have been a shame because someone had left my favorites. Sitting there was a bouquet of wildflowers, a box of those dark chocolate truffles Susan had always bought me, and a card. I was stunned for a moment, not quite believing what I was seeing. This was just the sort of thing she would do, too, and I expected her to jump around the corner and surprise me. She hadn't been very large, a wisp of a thing, but she liked to scare people and found it hilarious when she managed to. As the minutes stretched by and no scare seemed incoming, I picked up the stuff and brought it inside. I put the flowers in some water. I had never gotten flowers before, but I remembered that much, and set the chocolates on the table. I opened the card and found a pretty generic card inside, flipping it open to see who had sent it. I snorted as I read it, wondering whose bright idea that had been, but feeling a little better, nonetheless. "From your secret admirer" was written inside, the handwriting fine and spidery, just like hers had always been. As I ate the chocolates, I felt the tears come on unbidden. The taste, the smell, it all reminded me of Valentine's days past. We would sit and watch a movie, curled up on the couch together, while she munched at her Ferrero Rochers and I ate my chocolate truffles. We'd trade sometimes, and I wish now that I could see her eyes light up as I handed her one of my chocolates again. I passed out on the couch a little later, but my dreams were a little brighter that night. After that, I started finding other gifts. Food from my favorite Chinese place, candy, books by writers that I liked. One time, someone even delivered a seafood feast from Sir Crabbington's, and I was halfway through it before I realized it was mine and Susan's wedding anniversary. I waited till after I'd finished before crying this time, but the tears were still there. I never questioned these gifts, but I never looked for them either. I assumed they were from friends or from the girls at the office she had worked at, but their dedication was heartwarming if it was. My wife must have talked about me a lot for them to know my favorite foods and snacks, and I was honestly just happy for a break in the sadness. Each of these gifts made my day a little better, and the pain ebbed away a little more with each new package. Suddenly I was feeling inspired to write again. I had the energy to reach out to my old contacts and try to work. I was running in the evenings. I was doing laundry and dishes, and felt like I might be getting a little better. The gifts were nice, but it was the other things that started to make me wonder if the gifts were all that was being given. Sometimes I would wake up to find that the clothes were folded or the dishes were already done, and I couldn't remember having done them. Other times it would be simpler things easily explained but no less odd. A blanket thrown across me where there hadn't been one before. A pillow under my head when I had slept on the couch and left it in the bed. Sometimes as I came awake a little in the night, it seemed like I could see shadows moving in my house. I would sit up, the living room bathed in the light of whatever TV show I had fallen asleep watching, and look around for the source of the movement, finding nothing. It was weird, but I figured it was probably just my imagination. I'd been through a lot lately. Some mild hallucinations might be expected. It was on one of my jogs when I finally discovered the identity of my secret admirer. I was coming up the hallway, huffing a little from a longer jog than usual tonight, when I saw someone leaving something outside my door. I had to grab the wall for a minute when I first saw her because I thought it might be my wife. She was short, with brown hair that had been cut into a pixie cut. She was dressed normally enough in jeans and a t-shirt, but the high tops were also something that my wife favored. From the back, she looked exactly like my dead wife, except for the hair. My wife had always talked about getting it cut short, but she favored ponytails and braids too much to ever cut it too short. She was bent at the waist, leaving food or something for me, and when I called her name, she jumped. When she turned around, though, I could see that I'd been mistaken. The woman was similar, but her face was different. They could have been sisters, but there were definitely subtle differences. Her nose was rounder, her face less angular, and she just seemed less substantial. I began to wonder if she might be a cousin or something, but I couldn't think of anyone in Susan's family who looked much like her. "Oh my gosh," she said, looking embarrassed. "I guess you caught me. Sorry for being so mysterious. I just didn't want to mess up your morning. I was a friend of your wife's. My name's Anne." She offered me a hand to shake, and I likely looked just as unsure of myself as I took it. I told her to knock next time and come and share a meal with me. She agreed. That began our strange friendship. Anne was just the companion I needed, and we spent 2 or 3 nights a week in my living room. Some of you will lift an eyebrow at that, but it was never anything more than talk. Anne cried as often as I did, and the two of us reminisced over Susan and what she had meant to us. Anne, as it turned out, had known her far longer than I had. The two had been friends since they were children, and Anne told me about Susan's early life in a way that made them almost sound like sisters. The more she told me, the more I wondered why I'd never heard of her before. If Susan had known Anne since they were children, why was this the first time I was meeting her? Many of her stories were things that I had heard before, so they tracked, but any misgivings soon melted away as we spent our evenings remembering. Sometimes she held me while I cried. Sometimes I held her, but it was nice to have someone there in my grief. She had just gotten done with a particularly funny story about how Susan had cut her hair too short and given herself something like a mullet before shaving it down into a sloppy pixie cut when she suddenly began to cry. Her despair was deep, the sobs racking her, and when I went to hold her, she pressed her face against my chest. "I'm sorry, I miss her so much." I held her that night as she wept, and I think that was when I started to fall in love with her. It made me feel terrible, but I couldn't help it. She was so much like Susan. Even her voice reminded me a little of my dead wife. I didn't want to move on. I was still trying to process what to do next, but Anne helped a lot, and I I got the feeling that she didn't mind being that person for me. Suddenly, she was coming over every night, bringing food or wine, and we spent our evenings together. It didn't seem to bother her that I never wanted to leave the house. Didn't make any difference to her that I didn't cook, but the longer she was in my life, the more that changed. Suddenly, I was paying more attention to my clothes. I was taking on columns for online magazines and selling my short stories again. I was cooking dinners instead of eating takeout, and I felt as if I were getting better. Anne was a big supporter of this, pushing me to get better, and that was when I started to notice that something was a little off about her, something I should have noticed before then. Anne only came by after dark and was unavailable during the day. Anne had a very demanding job, but would change the subject any time I brought it up. Anne would always leave before dawn, if not well before. Anne wouldn't stay at the house, wanting her own space, which I could respect. These things on their own didn't seem so strange, but altogether they made me curious. I'd also wondered why Susan had never talked about Anne before. It was something that had always been at the back of my mind, but now it began to linger like a fishbone in my throat. If they were so close, why had I never met her? If they'd been friends since childhood, why hadn't she been at our wedding, at our parties, our trips, our gatherings of people that had been drawn around us? And Anne had never been seen at any of those. I asked Anne about that one night, and she waved it off, telling me I must have seen her at one of those things. I've been to every gathering you guys have thrown. I was at your wedding. I was at the funeral. I've been with you guys all the way. Made me think I was going crazy, but I couldn't remember seeing her before that night 2 months ago. I thought about going through old pictures, but neither of us had been picture-taking people. We kept our memories inside, not on our phones, though it made it a little difficult to check now. I was hesitant to bring any of this up in front of her as, well, I didn't want her to feel like I was accusing her of anything. Anne had become very important to me, and I didn't want to go back to sitting in my depression on the couch every night. That was until I saw something that I shouldn't have. We'd been watching a movie on the couch, something Susan and I had seen 1,000 times, and I dozed off towards the end. I had laid my head over on Anne, and if it bothered her, she gave no indication. I don't know how long we sat like that, the two of us together on the couch, but when she got up to leave, I came half awake as I mumbled something about seeing her later. She didn't respond, which I thought meant she hadn't heard me. But as I opened my eye a little, I saw something that froze me in my couch divot. The black shadow was standing in the doorway, its back to me as it prepared to step out into the dim hallway. The creature looked like tar, its form more of a feminine insinuation than a fact. It must have had its back to me, but when I inhaled sharply and fell off the couch, it turned back to see what had happened. I was on the floor, breathing harshly and trying to find enough breath to scream when the shadow creature bent down in front of me and spoke in Anne's voice. It's okay. This wasn't how I wanted you to find out, but I suppose it was inevitable. I couldn't find my breath. I looked at the thing that was speaking with Anne's voice, trying to make sense of all of this. What the hell was going on? In my head, I had wondered if Anne was some kind of stalker or a weirdo who was only pretending to know my wife, but this was a little bit beyond anything I had thought about. What? She glanced at the sliding door to our apartment, noticing the sun beginning to peek up and sucking in air. I don't have time now, but please listen. You have to trust me. I would never hurt you, and I'll explain what's going on. Some of the answers might not make a lot of sense, but I promise I'll tell you what's going on. Just wait till tonight, till I get off, and I'll tell you everything I can. Can you do that? I nodded, and She returned it slowly. She got up and walked towards the door, but turned back just before passing through it. I'm still Anne. I'm still the person you've known for the past few months. Just keep that in mind. She walked through the door and left me sitting on the floor of my living room. I was a mess all that day. I didn't understand anything. All I knew was that someone I'd grown pretty close to had turned into a featureless monster right before my eyes. I kept trying to convince myself throughout the day that it had all been a dream, that I was still dreaming, but the longer the day went on, the more I had to come to terms with the fact that it wasn't. That meant that whatever that thing had been, it was coming back here tonight. I'd have to make a choice when it got here. Did I let it in, or did I tell it to go away and lose Anne forever? When the knock finally came, night having crept up on me as I worried the day away, I looked out the peephole to see the same old Anne standing on my doorstep. As I opened the door, she breathed a sigh of relief and asked if she could come in. I let her in, figuring that if the creature had wanted to hurt me, it would have done it before now. "Okay," she said, not sitting as she paced the living room. "I know you've probably got a ton of questions, but just let me tell you my side before you jump to conclusions." She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she tried to find a place to begin. "I didn't lie. I have been with your wife for a very long time. In fact, I've been with her since she was born. Susan and I have gone everywhere together, right up until the day they buried her. I'm Susan's shadow." I squinted at her, not really sure what to make of that. "When your wife died, I was reassigned to someone else. Someone new. Someone very new, but I still remembered you. I wondered how you were and what you were doing. I hoped you were doing okay, and as this little person napped and ate and sat, I knew I had to go make sure you were all right. I had to stay with my new person during the day when the shadows are most noticeable, but at night I was free to roam a bit more. Babies don't move as much as you might think, and with a 7 o'clock bedtime, I was left with a lot of time to kill. I leave at 5 when the sun is coming up, and come back at night so I can see you." She stopped and looked at me in an expectant way, but my mind was altogether unprepared. "So you're Susan's shadow? How?" "Shadows are part of people, but once they're dead, we aren't really needed. I've been with Susan since the start, since the first time she met you, and I fell in love with you right alongside her. I had to know you were safe, to know that you hadn't given up, so I started coming back to our old house, and I found you suffering. So I left you gifts to keep your spirits up, little things to make you realize you were still loved. But I got careless. I let myself get seen, but I guess that worked out in the end. Turned out I was hurting too. I missed Susan. I missed her more than I had any of the other people I'd been attached to before. And talking with you helped me get over her, just as it helped you. We helped each other in the end, and that was what we both needed. We became what the other needed, and I'm thankful that you happened along and found me that day. I had questions, all kinds of questions, but the one that stuck seemed the most obvious. If you have someone new that you've attached to, does that mean that eventually you'll have to go?" She nodded slowly, like she hoped I wouldn't think of that right away. "Eventually, as the person I've been assigned to grows, she'll need me more than just during the day. I may have to stay with her more and more often at night, and that will ultimately mean less time with you. I want to be here for you, but I don't want to stop you from moving on either. You need to get past her, get past me and eventually return to life as you knew it. You deserve that. You deserve to be happy. I felt the tears leaking down my face, smearing her and turning her into a wavy half-person. Will you stay with me as long as you can? I asked. She nodded. I will. I'd really like that. That was 6 months ago. The little girl that she's become the shadow of, Anne, is starting to move around more, and Anne is happy with her progress. She doesn't think it'll be much longer before she's walking, but she promised that she'll come and see me for a while to come. One day she may decide that the nights are for going out and working, but for now, she's still tossing in her crib before the sun goes down, and that's just fine with me. I don't know how long I'll have Anne for, but I know it would never be long enough. Even as I write this, I know there will come a time when her visits become less and less, and I know that'll be fine too. I had Susan for 18 years, and I'll take whatever time I have with her shadow as a gift. And just like that, our stories have come to an end for another day. But don't worry, I'm sure there'll be many more days of cozy horror ahead of us. Until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.